I started watching it. I agree with Andrea. It was entertaining. And I was kind of excited thinking, wow, they're going to really show this study was done. They're going to show how the results, came out. But then as it went on, I realized that it was more advertising, I felt, than actual science.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see both of you.
Great to be here.
Hello.
I've been looking forward to this because we actually had to watch reality TV as research for this episode of Fat Science. You Are What You Eat, a Netflix special documentary that took pairs of twins, fed them different stuff, and then measured to see what the result was. It sounds so interesting. Andrea, this was your idea, I think, to bring this to the table. What was your first reaction when you watched this?
It was very entertaining because I liked the idea of seeing what the difference was between an omnivore diet versus a vegan diet, because I'm always interested in things about food. And I thought that it was interesting that it was a study with twins who have the same DNA, and then they would be exercising and somebody would be watching them and they would do a bunch of fancy schmancy tests and we would see things and we would learn about some vegan types of, diet versus meat. And I thought that that would be interesting. But then, of course, Dr. Cooper said, well, the test was really flawed and that doctor is not so good.
Wait a minute.
Wait a minute. I think Dr.
Maybe,
Cooper may.
He's interesting and the test was an interesting idea, but the study, they didn't really have that many people. And it was very entertaining. And why did they focus on sex? Like, what the hell was that? And
Oh my gosh.
then, they didn't really watch them exercise. I was like, oh, yeah, I guess it was
Dr.
really
Cooper, I'll let you defend yourself.
Okay.
Right. And then at the end, it said it was sponsored by some vegan foundation. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, they did.
Yeah.
So before you defend yourself,
Right.
Dr. Cooper, I think there's a bias. When I see a doctor from, say, Stanford or Harvard on anywhere, it could be on social media, it could be anywhere, but that automatically validates in my head that this is not a quack and that I should
me
probably...
too.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that we should believe them. But you have, Dr. Cooper, a very different mindset because it's all about the research, right? For you. You don't just believe stuff. You say, where's the evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Even in the research papers that you read, you have to really read through the entire thing. And at the end of good research papers, the authors will also point out some of the flaws with their own study, which is really good. But I agree. When you see Stanford, you think, this is legitimate.
Ooh,
Yeah.
fancy.
And so that kind of makes it even more disappointing when information is sort of represented in a way that's not really necessarily accurate. And so I started watching it. I agree with Andrea. It was entertaining. And I was kind of excited thinking, wow, they're going to really show this study was done. They're going to show how the results, came out. But then as it went on, I realized that it was more advertising, I felt, than actual science. It became pretty obvious, pretty much like right away. And there were some clues to that, just because there was a lot of product placement and there was a lot of talk about all kinds of different things like the environment, which really wouldn't have anything to do with a study like that. If you were doing a study, you wouldn't really be focusing on the environment. You wouldn't be focusing on these different like specific products. So it just started to sound kind of suspicious. And then I did look up the original research that was published, what this program was based on. And one of the things about the program, it didn't say it was loosely based on a study that was done. It actually presented as though it was the study. So
Right.
that it was really where I think the big flaw in the program is, because if they had said this is something we did that's loosely based on a study that was done, and we kind of took liberty to to elaborate in certain areas or ponder other things that had nothing to do with the study, I think then you wouldn't feel so kind of betrayed or by the information.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, in the show, they picked 4 sets of these twins, and I forgot how many.
Very
Yeah,
nice
very
looking.
nice. Yeah.
Very
I
nice
forgot how
looking.
many were in the original one. It was 20 something in the original published study, but they picked 4, and we still don't really know if those 4 were in the original one or if they're different ones. I'm assuming they were in the original one, but in a way, I find it hard to believe because the interventions that they showed on the TV show were different than what the interventions that were done for the research study were. So normally you wouldn't let a research subject be participating in an actual research study when they were engaged in like exercise if that wasn't part of the original research study. So I'm kind of confused. And I did try to do my own digging to find out if they have any actual data on the people that were actually in the show, if they show their data, because they show a lot of obtaining information like body composition, stool analysis, urine analysis, blood work, and they only show a very small fraction of the results in a very vague way for that group. But it's interesting. So in the original study, they did put these twins on either vegan or omnivore diet, and they went from having a baseline diet, and we don't really know a lot about their baseline diet, but they made the diets, whether they were omnivore or vegan, kind of healthy versions of those diets, with including whole grains and fruits and vegetables and things like that. And so they assumed it was stepping up the quality of their diets, whether they were in the omnivore or the vegan arm. But in the research study, they didn't do any exercise. They did not do body composition testing. They did collect stool, but they didn't test anything in the stool. They just thought maybe in the future they'd look at the microbiome, but they really didn't do a lot of the things that the show depicted. And so that's where there was
Oh,
there was a
that's weird.
big difference in that group that tested. So in the original study, the results also were very limited. They were mainly looking at LDL cholesterol and some other blood markers.
If you were going to design a study like this, Dr. Cooper, what would it look like? And also what kind of equipment would you use? I know they use this sort of scanning machine to come up with body composition. What would it look like if you did it?
Well, that the DEXA scan is a acceptable method. It's just that research also means that there's a certain way you conduct research. It's not just the equipment. For example, in the actual study, it said that there was not an emphasis on weight loss at all, that the research subjects were not at all counseled that this was a weight loss program, that it was more focused on health, and the goal was not to lose weight or anything like that. On the TV show, they may have said that, but every comment that was made, it was like, oh, now you fit on the DEXA scanner better. Oh, now you look better. Now I can see this change and that change in you. And it was completely like not what you would do in a research study. Anybody.
Right, and the twins were in competition with each other to who
Yeah.
could
And
lose more weight.
that is not what actual research looks like. Actual research is very objective. It doesn't go in with preconceived biases, or if it does, those are left at the door, because the researcher is really dedicated to finding the truth. whether it's something they believe in or they hypothesize, or if they're proven wrong. That's what science is. That's the beauty of science is your project is just as good if it proves that you're wrong as it is if it proves you're right. And a true researcher is, excited about just advancing the science and getting more answers. And so this show was kind of the opposite. It was going in with an agenda that the plant-based diet is going to be better, and that there'll be more weight loss, there'll be more this, and this. And then when they encountered that the people on the vegan diet lost a lot of muscle mass, they lost more weight, but they lost muscle more. And they said, well, you didn't, they blamed the person, the subject, the character, the twin. Well, you didn't eat enough, you didn't, that's because you did this, or you didn't do enough strength training. So that's, again, something that you would never see in a research study. You would not really see them turn around and blame the person, because they'd be doing an actual fixed protocol where everybody would be doing the same exercise. Everybody would have what's called isocaloric intake, that the calories would be regulated, and there actually is really good research being conducted where that is what happens. For dietary research, it's really important to have the subjects sequestered, I guess you would call it. And so there are researchers who have done studies like this where they bring the subjects into either a hospital environment or a residential environment where everything is completely monitored, and where everything's recorded very accurately of what they're actually eating, how much they're eating, making sure that both of those diets are equal in terms of macronutrients, that one's not higher in protein than the other, et cetera. So the show, what it's showing is not research. It's entertainment, basically.
Right. And then all the information that they had as the backup information was all about don't eat this, eat plants.
Yeah.
That it's better for the world and better, which, I mean, I thought some of that was actually very interesting. I mean, the farmed fish situation is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't think that was a bad thing to show.
But in the context of, that's what was kind of, it was too muddy. Like, it's like, let's do
Yeah.
a show.
It was the context that was
Maybe
bad.
they didn't need to do this as, they had two different things going on. They had that we're doing a study on these twins, but then we're also like educating on environment and
don't be a chicken farmer, grow
right,
mushrooms.
exactly.
And the music under it was really crazy to be like, oh, this is killing the world. When they showed that was
a lot
really
of
bad.
drama
That
in
was
there.
definitely not a, yeah, it was high
I think
drama.
for years, scientists have known that plant foods are very good for us. I mean, that's been pushed for many years. That's been kind of, every organization has said we need to eat lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, colorful foods, to increase our polyphenols and all those things, that the health benefits of those foods, I think, have been known for a long time. And whether it means going to be strict vegan or not, I don't think that was new information. And I think also the environmental impact of, farming, animal farming and stuff like that has been also recognized. And so all those things are good topics, but I think weaving it into, it just shows the bias and the agenda in there, which takes away the ability to look at this as a serious kind of, study. That's what they call it, sponsored by Stanford.
Dr. Cooper, do you have any patients who are strict vegans, and does that change how you treat them for metabolic dysfunction?
I do have patients that are strict vegans. I have patients that are vegetarian, patients who've gone back and forth. And it is pretty interesting that I really have come to believe, just based on clinical insight, that it's so individual what works for a person. And so while there's a lot of even healthcare professionals now advocating that everybody go vegan, there are people where they try to make those changes and you don't see improvements in their lab work and things like that. Their cholesterol doesn't look better. In fact, one thing that was interesting about the actual research study, it showed that the LDL cholesterol, which we nicknamed the bad cholesterol, it did drop in the vegan group. of twins. And so that did improve. And I think that's been kind of long known that saturated fat can aggravate LDL cholesterol. So once you move to a plant-based diet, you have less saturated fat in the diet. So that, and there are probably other reasons too why the LDL maybe dropped, but the triglycerides actually increased in the vegan group. Triglycerides are another fat in the blood, and the HDL cholesterol, which is the quote good cholesterol, that dropped in the vegan group. So not all the parameters improved. And then they point to that the insulin was lower in the vegan group, but at the same time, the glucose increased in the vegan group. So that's not necessarily what they are promoting as an improvement in the glucose insulin regulation. So I think that there's a mixed picture. And so the nice thing that we should take away from the actual study is that, well, some things seem to improve, but some things seem to not improve. And in the study, the vegan group did lose some weight, but they did not do the body composition testing. And remember, in the Netflix show, they did the body composition testing and saw the vegan group lost muscle. So in order to make any kind of assumption about that weight loss, you'd have to have the body composition testing to go with it to see, but they didn't have it in the original study. So I think it's just looking at research that way. Unfortunately, research is like literally like going in an inch at a time. And then you have to kind of go back and decide if you really want to look at anything else. But clinically, our patients, I see a huge difference person to person and I've even seen in, some groups of patients, they try to change their diet to see, they're kind of curious, let's see what this does. And then it's like, that went the opposite way that we were thinking it might go. And so then they go back to their original diet that felt better and made them feel better. So I kind of think you have to work with it on a more individual basis. But a lot of the research coming out now is focusing on what's called ultra processed foods. And what they really mean by that, it's not just, bread because it's made into flour. They're talking about foods that are made with a lot of like processing involving chemicals and additives and packaging that may be toxic getting into the food supply. And that is associated with, some health deterioration. And so I think whether sometimes people will go vegan, but now they're eating more processed, potentially ultra processed foods because they're trying to make foods that taste like meat. you know,
Or foods that taste like cheese.
yes, but again,
Yeah.
some of those products could be like really fine. They may just have a few ingredients that you look at the label and it's not, super processed, but others could be loaded up with all kinds of like emulsifiers and chemicals to give it a texture or give it a flavor. So I think that's where it's not just vegan, omnivore, and not just, you kind of have to look at the individual biology.
Yeah.
Right. Because so many of the vegan foods are just like chemical things to make something look like something else.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't they say that cheese was physically addictive or something like that in
Yes.
the in the show?
And then she showed liquid cheese to make frozen pizza. And I was like, huh? That just kind of, I don't know.
Well, and I think that was made of cashews. And I mean, there are some creative things coming out of the, food industry and the vegan food industry. But that was another thing that was kind of off-putting was the main narrator of the show that was the researcher. It turns out on the research study that was published in JAMA, they have to list their affiliations and any possible conflict of interest. So on the research study, it was listed that he was funded by Beyond Meat, which is one of the plant products.
hamburgers.
Yeah. And so it listed that he was funded by a vegan food company manufacturer. And so it wasn't thought to conflict with the actual published study, but they had to disclose it because it's a financial relationship that he has with that company.
Yeah.
And so this narrator has that. And then the organization that funded the Netflix documentary supports plant-based food manufacturers. And so a lot of the food placement within the program was probably, because of that. So,
So it's tainted, as we say, a little tainted.
well, I was happy to see that most people kind of did see through it. When you look on social media and comments about the show, a lot of people like saw that and were thinking, is this a commercial for the food industry, or is this an actual study?
Yes, but a lot of people who are like, let's all be vegans today, they're all like, look, see, it's the best thing to be.
And they also measured sexual arousal, which I don't think was part of the original study.
That was crazy.
That was crazy and kind of awkward
Yes.
as they're watching porn on their tablets. But Dr. Cooper, does diet impact sexual arousal / ability?
I don't think there's any good research about that. I mean, other than, what some diets can do over time, like say you are eating high saturated fat and you do develop any kind of plaque in your arteries, and then males like erections are affected if you have blood flow issues. And, so I think there's indirect connections, but not, that was pretty sensationalized. And the sexual arousal part. And then also they talked about the telomere length of their chromosomes changing. And it that also seemed like kind of far afield.
Ridiculous.
And that was not part of the original study either. But yeah, no.
Oh,
But these were both areas that they said improved. So they kind of maybe needed more things to say improved, because the only other one was the LDL that improved that they mentioned. But then the body composition results were that most people lost muscle mass that were in the vegan group. So that wasn't such a positive. So maybe they added the sexual arousal because they thought,
they needed some more
I
episodes.
don't really get it. I don't know.
it just seems like, what the hell are they doing? What is this? It was like, ugh, I don't need to watch that.
And what's the purpose of studying telomere length?
Telomeres are little strands on the ends of the chromosomes that are protective. And without the telomeres, the chromosome material can become damaged and unable to function, unable to lead to proper cell division and lead to proper cell health. And so it's very important that our telomeres are protected. But unfortunately, over time, they become more and more shortened, and our body does have a way to actually restore them and repair them. But a lot of people are looking at telomere length as a sign of aging. And so there's a focus on interventions that might improve the telomere length. And a lot of it is kind of gimmicky. So it is a real thing. It's just that in this particular show, they were talking about telomere length changing with the vegan versus the non-vegan diets. And they didn't really show us any actual data on that. And so we're just questioning what it is that they actually saw.
The actual study didn't do any fitness testing or any sort of endurance testing or anything like that, like the VO2 max thing that you have. How come?
Right. The actual study did not include anything to do with exercise. They actually didn't mention anything about an exercise protocol at all in the actual study. And they did not test fitness. So in the program, they used the gas exchange equipment, we call it gas exchange, to measure what's called the VO2 max, which is your maximal aerobic capacity. While you're exercising, it's measuring your oxygen and your carbon dioxide to see how you're burning fuel, basically. And that determines your fitness level. And so between that and measuring the body composition with the DEXA scanner and your stool and your urine and your telomere length, those are all things that were not included in the original study.
I would think that would have made a better full picture of what the hell was going on in your body with the two different diets and the two different processes.
Well, research funding is hard to get. And so you have to kind of pick your battles. And then also introducing a lot of variables, you have to regulate all the variables. So say they introduced exercise. That means that they have to document exactly what exercise people are doing. They have to do the exact same exercise. And so if they're testing their fitness before and after the program, the exercise they do in between has to be exactly the same. But then how are they going to know what improvements were made based on the exercise versus
Uh,
the diet? So it may be a
right.
future study, but first they have to establish, like, put down those posts for this is what the diet only did. Um,
This is why we have you to tell us about the
yeah,
science.
it's hard to look at.
See? I'm like, "Oh, why didn't they do this, 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 this?"
Well,
And you're like,
that's the
"Well."
beauty. That's the beauty of clinical medicine. We can do that. We're not doing a research study. We can take, our patients and say, well, let's test this and let's have you do this. And then another patient, you should probably do that. Or, you don't have to treat patients as research subjects. So that's kind of so much more flexible. But in research, it's
Right.
really particular, and everything has to be approved ahead of time. You've got to, you know, the equipment that you're going to use, the protocols you're going to use. You have to have record every little thing that you did and prove that you did it. So it is just way more detailed doing a research.
So that's why they go for the money from the vegan
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
Dr. Cooper, does length of study, does that have something to do when you're studying something as complicated as health and diet and all these other things that they're measuring? This was only a matter of weeks, this study. Would it be better to do it over a year or 2 or 3?
Oh, it's always better. The longer, the better. But especially with these dietary studies, they get more and more difficult to do for longer and longer periods because you have to pretty much control this research subject of what they're actually doing. They have to buy into the protocol and follow that protocol. And that's really hard. And so that's why I think having them come in to a place where they can stay and they've committed to stay there. And that's also really hard to find people that are willing to do that, put their life on hold and do these
Right.
things. But that's really why we don't have a lot of long term dietary studies. A lot of it is what's called like observational, which is just like observing what seems to happen in a population, or retrospective, where you have people and then you ask them, what did you do in the past? Is not very scientific versus being able to actually have them come in and control and record exactly what they're consuming, exactly what they're doing for their exercise, um, what medications they may be taking, everything controlled, so that you're trying to control all the variables you can so that you're not accidentally picking up signals from something else that the person's doing and not your intervention.
Well, because who's going to live in a controlled environment for a year, you know, and be in a
Yeah.
bubble? That's why it was interesting when they did that show, The Biggest Loser, and they were all in that bubble for, what, like a month or something. And then, of course, they left the bubble and everything that happened there
Yeah. Well,
didn't happen on the
and that was
outside.
interesting because they did follow up on the Biggest Loser participants 6 years later and found that not only had the vast majority, I think it was only like one or something that didn't regain the weight.
Right. I thought they
No,
all
there
did,
was like, I think
Was there
there
one?
was a one outlier, but also their metabolism rates were markedly slow. They
From all that
they were
abuse.
still slowed down, what they think, from the extreme exercise and dieting.
Hmm.
But I think research is great. It's like it is great, but sometimes it is disappointing because I feel like they continue. Often the easy road is to repeat the same study that someone else already did because it's like a roadmap of how you can get your work published. Just kind of do the same similar protocols and keep repeating that. That's done a lot in academia where the students need to do research publications. And so they kind of pick something that's one of the common things that's done in their field. And then they do that and publish that. And instead of trying to really advance the science, And there are some fields where that's changing, where there's a lot more collaboration around the world with scientists. And I think the Allen Institute that first started here in Seattle kind of was an innovator in that area, where they tried to collaborate with researchers all over the world to not repeat studies, but to instead kind of like more like a relay. Okay, we did this part and it brought up these questions. Who wants to take it from here? And then, being much more efficient that way of getting to answers. And I think that might be happening a little bit more around the country, but there's still a lot of repeating some very already known established science and wasting our time on that.
So this has been an analysis of the Netflix special, You Are What You Eat. Andrea, what's your big takeaway on this?
I think what I've learned here today is listen to Dr. Cooper. Go to the original. Don't pay attention to things that are media influenced, as I always am influenced. I'm very susceptible sometimes. And just, ask questions. Ask a lot of questions. Don't just look at the shiny objects.
Yeah. Dr. Cooper, how about you? What's your big takeaway?
Yeah, I agree. It's the headlines, the clickbait headlines, and as Andrea says, these shiny objects. You have to look further, look deeper, and you might not really understand the research study, though, that you're looking at. So maybe you could discuss it with someone that you think might understand it more, but I would still read through them. Even if you think you're not going to understand, go to the discussion at the end or the conclusion and see what the researchers are saying and what they point out for the flaws in their own study, and make sure it's coming from a peer review journal article and not from
not from People magazine.
So there you have it. You Are What You Eat. Kind of an entertaining show, but not super scientific. And this has been another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.